Hello everybody. How you doing? Hope you're doing well. Sorry, I'm just looking a little bit frazzled because my alarm was going off right on the time that I normally start streaming, like say hello to you, but it usually goes off earlier, so I must have missed it when I had headphones on earlier. And then on top of that, my hair was just being weird. I think it's time I had a haircut. It's like this long, the longest bit, and I normally have this bit here about this long, and then the rest of this sort of like more like this. But this time of year is not really the time of year for having your hair cut short, so I'm just going to have to leave it and try to remember to flick it out of the way before I get started with reading. Anyway, sorry, try and get that so it's less distracting. Right, what are we up to? Sorry, I'm looking all over the place, aren't I? We are reading The Story of the Amulet by Edith Nesbit, the third book in the trilogy about the Psammead. Apart from the children in the book, he is in each of the books, kind of. The second book, he's more referenced rather than the children actually having anything to do with him. So I'm trying to think what the most recent thing we did was in the story. Just a moment and I shall unlock my book again. I read using a first generation iPad mini that was a hand-me-down gift, and the reason I use that is because it's actually quite cool to not send everything to the rubbish just because it's old. People too, actually. Books especially. If they're still of interest, if they can still be used, keep hold of them. So the last chapter we had was The Queen in London, which is where the Queen of Babylon had actually ended up, because of a wish she had made before the children had left Babylon, had ended up in London. So the next chapter, the one we have today, is called Atlantis. And I'm thinking this means they're going to go to Atlantis, of course. How far through the book are we? According to the... Oops, I hit the library button, not the chapter button. According to this, we are we're probably in the last third, or about to start the last third of the book. We have 6 chapters, including the one that I'm about to read. So we'll see how we go. Come on, resume. Thank you. So, hi, if you're new here, I'm Jev. I read old children's books. Often they are books that would look a little bit like this, where they've got the gold work on the front cover. The illustration will look like it's based off an old etching or something like that. The text on the page, when you run your fingers over it, you can actually feel how the press has printed the letters into the paper. And then when you look at the illustrations up close, I'm just trying to get this where you can get enough light that you can see it. Ooh, nice and crisp. That's good. So this illustration is made as an etching. Often etchings are based off a piece of artwork, and then an artist who is very skilled in etchings will copy the painting but use a metal plate or a stone slab or something like that, and they will scratch or etch with acid and things like that the design, the illustration, into that surface. The surface is then cleaned but not made smooth again, and ink is rubbed across it, and the excess ink is wiped off, obviously, and then it is the etching plate, whether it's a stone slab or whether it's metal or wood even, some of them are out of wood, put the etching plate and paper for the pages of the book are put into a press and squeezed together very, very, very hard, and that pressure means that the paper then, when the paper is peeled away from the etching plate, actually takes the ink with it, which creates the illustration you've got. And it's takes a lot of skill to, first of all, make the original plate, and then secondly, to ink it appropriately for the illustration to come through well. And so that's one of the reasons why illustrated books were a lot more expensive than just printed books, because printed books, yes, it took a lot of labour to take every cast piece of, often it was lead or a similar metal, assemble them together, every letter into bunches that made up words and sentences and paragraphs, and lock those all into a frame to make all of the words and everything for the page. They were assembled piece by piece into a frame and then inked up and put through a press, and the ink transfers onto the page, and there you have your your text of your book as well as your illustration. I don't know what order they did them in. I think it depended on the printing system. Anyway, so quite a labour-intensive system. If you actually, sorry, I'm just looking at it up close. I don't know if you'll be able to see, if I can get it close enough for you to see it. There's my fingers. Yes, oh yes. If you look very carefully, I try not to wiggle it too much, you can actually see that the images are often made from fine lines. And the lines, the thicknesses of the lines, are what give a bit of variation in how dark the page is. I'm sorry, I have to take my shoes off, my slippers off. My feet are getting too hot, which is making me too hot. Anyway, there we go. So, I grew up reading those sort of books. They were my parents' books. They were my grandparents' books. They were books that they had all read when they were children. And because of the value of books back in the day, you didn't throw them away. If they were anything that you had enjoyed at all, or if you thought that somebody else would enjoy them, you would share them, but they would still be yours, and you would look after them. So, for instance, this book here, I don't remember this one specifically when I was a child, but it was in amongst my dad's things because it had belonged to his mother's brother, Lawrence Lord, and he had been given it as a Sunday school prize in July 1897. 2007, 2017, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. So that would be, in July this year, this book would have been gifted to him 125 years ago. 25? 15 years ago. Yeah, 25 years ago. 125 years ago. This would have been printed before then. And books were often printed in large batches, quite a number of them, not quite the same number as we have these days because it's more people now, but they would be printed and then stored, and once they were requested for by a shop, a shop would request a dozen of this particular book and 2 dozen of that particular book and whatever, and pay for them. They would be shipped off to that bookshop and then sold. So often a book would be printed a number of years before it was actually gifted as a brand new book, just because that's the way the system worked. Now we have print on demand. I can write a book, I can put it online on somewhere like Amazon, through their ebook system, their digital book system. I can, if I can persuade someone to, I can sell as many copies as I want to of it, and not actually have to deal with the printer, not have to deal with the publisher. I can do all those things myself. There will be some small fees involved with it, but in theory, the cost of selling the book is going to actually return to me more than what return the profit from selling the book to me, and I could make a living off it if I did well enough. Now, every book that you order through an ebook publisher is either part of a small batch that was printed, no, not ebooks, physical books that you order through the same sort of publishers. They actually do different editions of the printed matter. So in an ebook, when you change the size of your font on the page, the number of pages it has in the book changes. In a printed book, the printer decides how many pages it's going to have, what size the print is, if it's a traditional printing. If it's a print-on-demand book, which a lot of the ones through Amazon are these days, then the author decides how the layout is going to be done, or they pay somebody to do all those things, and then they upload the file to Amazon, and then Amazon, when somebody orders the book, then tells their printing system to print that book and then ship it to that person. So you don't have first editions anymore. You don't have books that are one of the very, very few that were printed in the first printing, because it wasn't, the publisher didn't deem it was going to be popular enough to print many of them. That's caught them unawares a few times, where they've actually had a book that they have published, didn't think it was going to be popular, only had a few hundred or whatever printed, and then suddenly for some strange reason it becomes very popular, and they've had to reprint it, and it will often go into a second or a third edition, which means they have tweaked the layout or the text or the illustrations or the cover or the whatever else a little bit. That's what makes a different edition. Sometimes it'll be between whether it's got pictures in it or not pictures, that sort of thing. But they'll either go to another printing, or they'll actually go reissue the book as a new edition, and in the old days. And if it has suddenly taken off, if there's a lot of demand for it, if there's lots of booksellers who are asking the publishers, the printers for this book, then they will print a lot more copies of it. That's the way the system used to work. It still kind of works a little bit like that with traditional publishers these days, but print on demand has put an end to a lot of the monopolies that used to be around with book publishing. And I know people who say, I will never ever read a book that is self-published. Well, you do get, if you're using if you're buying through somewhere like Amazon, you can actually, on most books, if it's a new book, you can actually use their look inside feature, which is online. You can actually see the text of the book, part of it, the first few pages, and usually there's enough of the actual main part of the book where you can actually have a little bit of a pre-read and decide if it sounds like it's the sort of book that you want to read. I think you should judge a book based on what it seems to be like, rather than, oh, that person published the book all for themselves, I'm not going to buy that. In other words, you've decided that the big publishing houses are going to get all of your money rather than the author. There are actually some brilliant books out there written by authors who have published the books themselves and released them through Amazon, through Google Books, and all of those other sort of sources. There's a lot of them. Anyway, thanks for following, Tina. Good to have you here. I'm just giving people a little bit of a roundup on some of what I do, plus the general chit chat that I do, which can go in any direction whatsoever, but it's usually something to do with books. So that's where we are at the moment. I haven't started reading, but I will do very shortly. What else? Oh, and if you've just followed, you do actually have some emotes available to you as a follower. I do have follower emotes. I've only got one subscriber emote, which isn't really going to draw the crowds yet. I will actually get some more done sometime. So I'm going to be reading the next chapter or two of the story of the Amulet in a minute. I've just got a couple of tips for you. Actually, no, I've got three or four tips. So the first tip is make sure you have something to drink handy, because it's thirsty work. Water is brilliant because it keeps your brain functioning as well as your body. I wave that water bottle around, but these days I mainly drink from this. But that's just because then I don't splash it all over the place when I'm waving it around. Have yourself something to drink handy. If you like a hot drink, make sure you've got something like that handy. If you want something a little harder to drink, a little bit more alcohol in it, if that's your thing, I don't have a problem with that. Get yourself something to drink. The next tip is make sure you have snacks. So I've got a range of snacks here today. I picked these up this morning along at our little kind of a department store, but it's a bits and pieces store, and it's a bit bigger than just a little corner one. Oreo double stuffed cinnamon bun, which I have never come across before. Oreos aren't actually a a variety of biscuit that have been particularly big in New Zealand up until recently. And then Griffin's, which is a New Zealand brand, pink iced mini donuts. They're actually just little biscuits, you would call them cookies if you're a North American. They're a little bit like, for those who've been here before, a little bit like a mini but donut shape, round shaped with a hole in the middle version of the hundreds and thousands biscuits I've had before. So this is what this one is. Just trying to see if I can get it to actually focus. Kind of. So it's not very big. Yeah, very small. Anyway, so I've got a couple of snacks here today. So make sure you've got something to drink and something to snack on. Brilliant, because then you can actually enjoy it. You can kick back, relax, whatever. And then the third main tip is make sure you've got somewhere comfortable to sit. I'm on my office chair, but I've got a nice handy cushion. Not that I've ever used it while I'm actually doing work or reading. But get yourself somewhere to sit where you can just lie back and enjoy it, or get all snug if you're somewhere cold, like New Zealand's a little bit colder at the moment, that sort of thing. And if you are somewhere warm, then somewhere that's not too snug, somewhere that you get a little bit of a nice cool breeze, if you can. Now, if you have to study or work and you've just got me chattering in the background, that's all great. It's lovely to have you here. I'm glad I can entertain you for a few minutes. I will end up going off on lots of rabbit trails while I'm reading. That is normal here. That's part of what people expect. Not necessarily come for, but they expect. We learn all sorts of things. Sometimes everybody else learns and I just talk about stuff that I already knew, to do with the life I've lived, the places I've lived, history I'm aware of, things like that, places I've visited. Because I have had a fair bit of life experience, as you can tell from the colour of the hair. And sometimes it will be stuff that either I'm looking up on the computer and then sharing with you, or people in chat will look something up and then put it into chat, and I will read that out so that the people who are watching this who don't have the benefit of chat, i.e. the people who are over on YouTube, because I will be trimming this so it's just the video image and the sound, and putting this up on YouTube later on, they will still get to hear what the discussion has been about, where it's relevant in our chat. So I do have some reasonably stringent chat, not just rules, but moderation settings, not to stop people having fun, but just because I want this to be a safe place for grandmas and their grandchildren who need something to do, and grandma wants to share a story but doesn't have the book for it, or something like that, and they can actually share the experience together. Because often it's the grannies and granddads and great uncles and those sort of people who have read books like these, or these actual books themselves, and so they hold some very precious memories for them and they want to share them with their grandchildren. I've had quite a few comments in other places from people in that sort of situation. Sometimes it's parents, sometimes it's grandparents, and they've really loved being able to share the stories that they remember from when they were growing up, or from before they were growing up, when it was other members of their family read them as well. So that's the background. I'm just looking around to see if there's anything else that I'm meant to be dealing with that I can see handy. No, I can't at the moment. Great to have you here, and how about I get on with reading? So I'm Jev. I'm reading The Story of the Amulet by Edith Nesbit, and we're up to chapter 9, and chapter 9 is Atlantis. So here we go. Oh, and I'm terrible at accents, by the way. Sorry about that. It's just one of those things, but it can be quite funny, actually. So here we go. Chapter 9, Atlantis. You will understand that the adventure of the Babylonian queen in London was the only one that had occupied any time at all, because all of their previous adventures, the children have gone somewhere else, and when they come back, it's like they hadn't been away. This one happened while they were in London, and so time had passed. That's what this was referring to. But the children's time was very fully taken up by talking over all the wonderful things seen and done in the past, where, by the power of the amulet, they seemed to spend hours and hours, only to find when they got back to London that the whole thing had been briefer than a lightning flash. maybe I shouldn't explain ahead, I should just keep reading. They talked of the past at their meals, in their walks, in the drawing room, in the first floor drawing room. The first one of those two was in the dining room, in the first floor drawing room, which is like a sitting room for us. But most of all, on the stairs. It was an old house. It had once been a fashionable house, and was a fine one still. The banister rails of the stairs were excellent for sliding down, and in the corners of the landings were big alcoves that had once held graceful statues, and now quite often held the graceful forms of Cyril, Robert, Anthea, and Jane. These are the children that are the four main characters in our story. They are currently staying with their old nurse, the lady who used to look after them when they were little, because their father is away reporting on the war over in Manchuria, which I think was between the English and the Russians, but I don't know. It was against the Russians. I initially thought it was between the Japanese and the Russians, because Manchuria had been a puppet state of the Japanese, even though it was mainland China. I'm not sure. I really don't know. And the term I just used is actually just what I've heard used before, so that's why I'm using it. So father is away being a reporter on the other side of the world, because the children are in England, and mother is away in Malta because she has been ill and she has been sent away to recuperate. And she has taken the youngest member of the family, the Lamb, that's their nickname for him, with her. Probably because it's easier than getting somebody else to look after him. And probably not as stressful as having all of the children with her. So the children are now staying with their old nurse, who lives on a street called Fitzroy Street in London. Now, it is a real street, and the photograph you'll see behind me here is taken in 1910. That's 4 years after this book was written, was published. Okay, so this style of building that you see here is probably the style of building that is being referred to. These ones here, these are also some of the buildings on Fitzroy Street. And you can see they're using horse and cab or carriage, carts. Men wander around in dark suits with tall hats. These will be gas lights probably, all this sort of stuff. No, this side here. Did you see that? The lady with the well-fitted upper part of her dress, and then the lower half has a lot more fullness to it. One of the fashions of the day. So this is, I think they call this period the Edwardian period, the time when Edward after Queen Victoria, I can't remember which number Edward was. Edward the Sixth, I don't know, was king. And so fashions had loosened a little bit. They'd become a little bit more relaxed. Some of the rules of society were a little more relaxed than what they had been during the Victorian era. It's famous for having had some very tight societal restrictions, although they really were mainly in certain sectors of society, not across the board. So this is the sort of scene that the children would have seen when they went out the front door to go for a walk to Regent's Park, which was a little bit of a walk, but it was still walkable to get there, or to catch an omnibus, which would be a horse-drawn, like a cart, but longer. And they were allowed to go out together to go to the park and places like that, or the shops, because that was the done thing, that you were allowed to do that. So the children are keeping themselves entertained most of the time, and Nurse is probably quite happy about that. And this is one of those rambles that I will do from time to time in the story, especially if we're just getting started on a chapter and I think that people may not be aware of what's going on. We will get into it, and I'll get to the point where I almost forget to stop for those things. Anyway, we've talked about the style of the house, where they were. Quite often the alcoves and the stairwell on the landings, instead of having ornate statues, would have the children in. One day Cyril and Robert, in tight white underclothing, had spent a pleasant hour in reproducing the attitudes of statues seen either in the British Museum, which is also nearby that they can get to, or in Father's big photograph book. But the show ended abruptly because Robert wanted to be the Venice of Milo, And for this purpose he pulled at the sheet which served for drapery at the very moment when Cyril, looking really quite like the Discobolos with a gold and white saucer for a discus thrower, was standing on one foot, and under that one foot was the sheet. Oh dear. So Cyril is looking like the carved statue of the discus thrower with all his weight on one foot. I think that's the one where the guy's arm is back like this and he's leaning forward and he's got this round disc which is quite heavy, which they heft backwards and forwards and then they spin around and then throw it, and it goes off into the distance, and it was as far as you could throw it. That would be your entry for that competition. Often used used to be anyway, in sports events like the Olympics and things like that. And probably from the original Olympics. They were a competitive sport thing back in the Greek period. Anyway, so Robert is pulling the sheet and Cyril is posed on one foot, probably standing in one of these alcoves. Of course, the Discobolus and his disc and the would-be Venus, that was Robert, came down together, and everyone was a good deal hurt, especially the saucer, which would never be the same again, because he was using a saucer and pretending it was the discus. It was white and gold. Saucers don't do well when they hit the floor hard, do they? Oh dear. However, neatly, one might join its uneven bits with secutine or the white of an egg. That's ways of gluing together ceramics. Not going to look the same. I hope you're satisfied, said Cyril, holding his head where a lump was rising. Quite, thanks, said Robert bitterly. His thumb had been caught in the banisters and bent itself back, almost to breaking point, so his thumb's rather sore too. I am so sorry, poor dear squirrel, said Anthea. The children have nicknames for each other, so Cyril is sometimes called Squirrel. And you were looking so lovely. I'll get a wet rag. Bobs, go and hold your hand under the hot water tap. It's what ballet girls do with their legs when they hurt them. I saw it in a book. What book? Said Robert disagreeably, but he went. When he came back, Cyril's head had been bandaged by his sisters, and he had been brought to the state of mind where he was able reluctantly to admit that he supposed Robert hadn't done it on purpose. That's a good place to be. Robert replying with equal suavity, Anthea hastened to lead the talk away from the accident. I suppose you don't feel like going anywhere through the Amulet, she said. Egypt, said Jane promptly. I want to see the pussycats. Not me. Too hot, said Cyril. It's about as much as I can stand here, let alone Egypt. So this is summertime in London, which can get a little bit claustrophobic and hot. Because you're not up on a hill with grass around you and trees and open breezes and things like this. Understandably. It was indeed hot, even on the second landing, which was the coolest place in the house. So this is probably on the north side of the house and probably with windows that are open to let the air through. I keep getting lost on the page. Let's go to the North Pole, said Cyril. Oh dear, not a good idea, really. I don't suppose the amulet was ever there, and we might get our fingers frostbitten so that we could never hold it up to get home again. No thanks, said Robert. It's reasonable explanation, actually. I say, said Jane, let's get the Samoyed and ask its advice. It will like us asking, even if we don't take it. That's an interesting thought. Have you noticed that? That people, even if you don't take somebody's advice, they actually like you asking for their advice. People like to be treated as the experts or the ones who can help by being the person and having a little bit more clout. So the Samoyed was brought up in its green silk embroidered bag. Now the Samoyed is the sand fairy that the children met in the first book, who granted them wishes every day. And now he has promised not to do that because it was wearing him out. But somehow or other this amulet is able to do things, like take them to places. So we'll see what happens. But before the Psammead could be asked anything, the door of the learned gentleman's room opened and the voice of a visitor who had been lunching with him was heard on the stairs. He seemed to be speaking with the door handle in his hand. In other words, he was standing at the door, holding on to the door handle with it open while he's talking into the room where the learned gentleman is. Now, the learned gentleman is an historian, from what we understand. I originally thought that he had specialised in Egypt and therefore was an Egyptologist, but he's also talked about some other things in a quite knowing manner, so I think he's just generally an historian. I don't think he's actually an archaeologist, because he likes to sit in his room and look at books rather than go to places and dig things up. So he's talking to this visitor, and the visitor is saying to him, "You see the doctor, old boy," he said. "All that about thought transference is just simply twaddle. You've been overworking. Take a holiday. Go to Dieppe," which is in France. "I'd rather go to Babylon," said the learned gentleman. "I wish you'd go to Atlantis sometime while we're about it, so as to give me some tips for my 19th century article when you come home." "I wish I could," said the voice of the learned gentleman. "Goodbye," said his visitor. "Take care of yourself." The door was banged, and the visitor came smiling down the stairs, a stout, prosperous, big man. The children had to get up to let him past. "Hello, kiddies," he said, glancing at the bandages on the head of Cyril and the hand of Robert. "Been in the wars?" "It's all right," said Cyril. "I say, what was that Atlantic place you wanted him to go to? We couldn't help hearing you talk." "You talk so very loud, you see," said Jane soothingly. "Atlantis," said the visitor. "The lost Atlantis, Garden of the Hesperides, great continent, disappeared in the sea. You can read about it in Plato." "Thank you," said Cyril doubtfully. Plato is something that the boys are possibly having to read at school or will be in the future. And usually when boys had to read it at school, they were reading it in Latin. So basically he's told them to do a whole lot more schoolwork, and I don't think they're impressed. So the learned gentleman is a boarder in the house. He lives up on the top floor and has his meals provided by their old nurse, which is how the children know him. "Thank you," said Cyril doubtfully. "Were there any amulets there?" asked Anthea, made anxious by a sudden thought. "Hundreds, I should think. So he's been talking to you?" "Yes, often. He's very kind to us. We like him awfully." "Well, what he wants is a holiday. You persuade him to take one. What he wants is a change of scene. You see, his head is crusted so thickly inside with knowledge about Egypt and Assyria and things that you can't hammer anything into unless you keep hard at it all day long for days and days, and I haven't time." "But you live in the house. You can hammer almost incessantly. Just try your hands, will you? Right. So long." He went down the stairs 3 at a time, and Jane remarked that he was a nice man, and she thought he had little girls of his own. "I should like to have them to play with," she added pensively. The 3 elder ones exchanged glances. Cyril nodded. "All right, let's go to Atlantis," he said. "Let's go to Atlantis and take the learned gentleman with us," said Anthea. "He'll think it's a dream afterwards," because they've had that happen with something. I can't remember what it was. And he was absolutely certain he was having a dream, and some of what he's just been talking about with this other chap, the visitor, was actually things where he felt he had developed the ability to transfer his thoughts about something to the children because of some things that they had said, which he could not understand how they would know, except he had been thinking about them, and it was to do with Babylon. It turns out that they knew because they'd been there, because the amulet had taken them there. Anyway, we'll carry on. "He'll think it's a dream afterwards," said Anthea, "but it'll certainly be a change of scene." "Why not take him to nice Egypt?" asked Jane. "Too hot," said Cyril shortly. "Or Babylon, where he wants to go?" "I've had enough of Babylon," said Robert, "at least for the present, and so have the others. Don't know why," he added, forestalling the question on Jane's lips. Jane is the youngest. She had not been put into prison in Babylon. She had not been threatened with death in any other way like that. And so therefore they are trying to make sure that she doesn't get too worried about things by telling her that what the risks were that they were subjected to when they were in Babylon. They don't want her to not do this time travel stuff with them. They actually still want her to be involved. They don't want to scare her off. Anyway, carrying on. Forestalling the question on Jane's lips. But somehow we have. I'll read the whole sentence instead of part of it, because then it'll make more sense. I've had enough of Babylon, said Robert, at least for the present, and so have the others. I don't know why, he added, forestalling the question on Jane's lips, but somehow we have. Squirrel, let's take off these beastly bandages and get into flannels. We can't go in our unders. So they weren't rudely attired, but it would have been frowned upon. They were fairly decently attired. They didn't have stretchy clothing at that stage, so it would be the equivalent of the shape of a singlet or a t-shirt, but out of non-stretching fabric, probably cotton, fairly lightweight, but used as an undergarment between whatever they were wearing on top. It stops you getting too itchy. It also stops your good clothes getting dirty from the inside as much, especially if you get very sweaty or anything like that. And then shorts would have been a little bit like boxer shorts, the non-stretchy ones. And so not to be seen in public wearing those. Flannels were the sort of things that the boys would wear at school in summer when it was like a sports day or something like that, and probably what they would wear around home when they're not at school, when the weather is reasonable. Not what you wear in winter, because that would be more like a woolen suit. Anyway, so they're going to go and put some clothes on over the top of their undergarments, which they referred to as unders. He wished to go to Atlantis, so he's got to go sometime, and he might as well go with us, said Anthea. This was how it was that the learned gentleman, permitting himself a few moments of relaxation in his chair, after the fatigue of listening to opinions about Atlantis and many other things, with which he did not at all agree, opened his eyes to find his 4 young friends standing in a row in front of him. Will you come, said Anthea, to Atlantis with us? To know that you are dreaming shows that the dream is nearly at an end, he told himself, or perhaps it's only a game like How Many Miles to Babylon. He's trying to get his head around the fact that these adventures are happening, but it doesn't fit with his adult thinking, so therefore he assumes it's all a dream. So he said aloud, Thank you very much, but I have only a quarter of an hour to spare. Doesn't take any time, said Cyril. Time is only a mode of thought, you know, and you've got to go sometime, so why not with us? Fair enough. Very well, said the learned gentleman, now quite certain that he was dreaming. Anthea held out her soft pink hand. He took it. She pulled him gently to his feet. Jane held up the amulet. To just outside Atlantis, said Cyril, and Jane said, The name of power. You owl, said Robert. It's an island. Outside an island's all water. I won't go. I won't, said the Samiad, kicking and struggling in its bag. He's allergic to water. It injures him, and it could kill him. So, yeah, sand's okay, water not. But already the amulet had grown to a great arch. Cyril pushed the learned gentleman, as undoubtedly the firstborn, through the arch, not out into the water, but onto a wooden floor, out of doors. The others followed. The amulet grew smaller again, and there they all were, standing on the deck of a ship, whose sailors were busy making her fast with chains to rings on a white quayside. The rings and chains were of a metal that shone red-yellow, like gold. Everyone on the ship seemed too busy at first to notice the group of newcomers from Fitzroy Street. Those who seemed to be officers were shouting orders to the men. They stood and looked across the wide quay to the town that rose beyond it. What they saw was the most beautiful sight any of them had ever seen or ever dreamed of. The blue sea sparkled in soft sunlight. Little white-capped waves broke softly against the marble breakwaters that guarded the shipping of a great city from the wilderness of winter winds and seas. Sorry, I just need to see where something is. That one. And move it to the right place. I'm just getting ready. I'm just getting ready. No, I'm just getting ready to show you the next pictures in the story. Sorry, it's not quite as I'm expecting it to be for finding it. Right, okay, now I know where I am. Sorry, carrying on. That guarded the shipping of a great city from the wilderness of winter winds and seas. The quay was of marble, white and sparkling with a veining bright as gold. The city was of marble, red and white. The greater buildings that seemed to be temples and palaces were roofed with what looked like gold and silver. But most of the roofs were of copper that glowed golden red on the houses on the hills among which the city stood, the hills amongst which the city stood. Not the houses amongst which the city stood, because that doesn't make sense. And shaded into marvellous tints of green and blue and purple where they had been touched by salt sea spray and the fumes of the dyeing and smelting works of the lower town. Broad and magnificent flights of marble stairs ran up from the quay to a sort of terrace that seemed to run along for miles, and beyond rose the town, built on a hill. The learned gentleman drew a long breath. "Wonderful," he said, "wonderful." "I say, mister, what's your name?" said Robert. "He means," said Anthea with gentle politeness, "that we never can remember your name. I know it's Mr. D. something." "When I was your age I was called Jimmy," he said timidly. "Would you mind? I should feel more at home in a dream like this if anything that made me seem more like one of you." In other words, he's wanting to feel like he's a child again. "Thank you, Jimmy," said Anthea with an effort. It seemed such a cheek to be saying Jimmy to a grown-up man. "Jimmy, dear," she added with no effort at all. Jimmy smiled and looked pleased. But now the ship was made fast, and the captain had time to notice other things. He came towards them, and he was dressed in the best of all possible dresses for the seafaring life. "What are you doing here?" he asked rather fiercely. "Do you come to bless or to curse?" "To bless, of course," said Cyril. "I'm sorry if it annoys you, but we're here by magic. We come from the land of the sun rising," he went on explanatorily. "I see," said the captain. No one had expected that he would. "I didn't notice at first, but of course I hope you're a good omen. It's needed. And this," he pointed to the learned gentleman, "your slave, I presume?" "Not at all," said Anthea. "He's a very great man, a sage, don't they call it? And we want to see all your beautiful city and your temples and things, and then we shall go back and he will tell his friend, and his friend will write a book about it." "What," asked the captain, fingering a rope, "is a book?" "That's a good question." "A record, something written, or," she added hastily, remembering the Babylonian writing, "or engraved." Some sudden impulse of confidence made Jane pluck the amulet from the neck of her frock. She wears it on a long string around her neck, so it can be hidden inside her clothing, and not lost. "Like this," she said. The captain looked at it curiously, but the other three were relieved to notice, without any of that overwhelming interest, were relieved to notice that he was looking without the overwhelming interest which the mere name of it had roused in Egypt and Babylon. "The stone is of our country," he said, "and that which is engraved on it is like our writing, but I cannot read it. What is the name of your sage?" Jimmy." said Anthea hesitatingly. The captain repeated, Jimmy. Will you land? He added. And shall I lead you to the king's? Look here, said Robert, does your king hate strangers? Our kings are 10, said the captain, and the royal line, unbroken from Poseidon, the father of us all, has the noble tradition to do honour to strangers if they come in peace. Then lead on, please, said Robert, though I should like to see all over your beautiful ship and sail about in her. I do actually have a picture from when he was looking at the amulet, the symbol. There he is, and he's saying, the stone is of our country. So here's the children, and there's Jimmy, who's now called Jimmy because of Anthea's hesitation. I should like to see all over your beautiful ship and sail about in her, said Robert. That shall be later, said the captain. Just now we're afraid of a storm. Do you notice that odd rumbling? That's nothing, master, said an old sailor who stood near. It's the pilchards coming in, that's all. Too loud, said the captain. There was a rather anxious pause, then the captain stepped onto the quay and the others followed him. Do talk to him, Jimmy, said Anthea as they went. You can find out all sorts of things for your friend's book. Please excuse me, he said earnestly. If I talk, I shall wake up, and besides, I can't understand what he says. No one else could think of anything to say, so that it was in complete silence that they followed the captain up the marble steps and through the streets of the town. There were streets and shops and houses and markets. It's just like Babylon, whispered Jane, only everything's perfectly different. It was a great comfort the 10 kings have been properly brought up to be kind to strangers, Anthea whispered to Cyril. Yes, he said, no deepest dungeons here. There were no horses or chariots in the street, but there were hand-carts and low trolleys running on thick log wheels, and porters carrying packets on their heads, and a good many of the people riding on what looked like elephants. Only the great beasts were hairy, and they had not that mild expression we're accustomed to meet on the faces of elephants at the zoo. Mammoths, murmured the learned gentleman, and stumbled over a loose stone. The people in the streets kept crowding round them as they went along, but the captain always dispersed the crowd before it grew uncomfortably thick by saying, Children of the sun god and their high priest, come to bless the city. And then the people would draw back with a low murmur that sounded like a suppressed cheer. Many of the buildings were covered with gold, but the gold on the bigger buildings was of a different colour, and they had sorts of steeples of burnished silver rising above them. Are all these houses real gold? Asked Jane. The temples are covered with gold, of course, answered the captain, but the houses are only orichalcum. Orichalchum. Odd word. I've never heard that one before. Maybe you can look it up and put it in the chat so we can find out about it. I'm not sure if it's a real thing or if it's a story imaginary thing. Anyway, we're going to carry on reading once I've found this picture for you for the next bit. When I find the right part of the story. Right, okay. Oh, I'm going to have to resize that one a little because it's a bit too big. I'll get this ready and then I can show it to you shortly. We'll only be reading one chapter today because I am... sorry. It's just the way it is. The houses are only orichalchum. It's not quite so expensive. The learned gentleman, now very pale, stumbled along in a dazed way, repeating, Orichalchum, orichalchum. Don't be frightened, said Anthea. We can get home in a minute just by holding up the charm. Would you rather go back now? We could easily come some other day without you. Oh, no, no, he pleaded fervently. Let the dream go on. Please do, said the learned gentleman. The High Jimmy is perhaps weary with his magic journey, said the captain, noticing the blundering walk of the learned gentleman, and we are yet very far from the great temple where today the kings make sacrifice. He stopped at the gate of a great enclosure. It seemed to be a sort of park, for trees showed high above its brazen wall. The party waited, and almost at once the captain came back with one of the hairy elephants and begged them to mount. This they did. It was a glorious ride. Here we have a picture. There's someone at the front here, and then there's the crowds, and then there is this woolly mammoth. Actually, I'm going to see if I can change the size a little bit so you can see. Look, there's the children up on top, and it doesn't have the docile expression on its face that we're used to seeing on elephants in the zoo, was the previous comment. So I'll put this back where it was. You can keep looking at that for a little bit longer while I carry on reading. So this is how they're going to get up to the main part of the city, away from the docks. Sorry, I'll move over a little bit so you can still see it. He begged them to mount. This they did. It was a glorious ride. The elephant at the zoo, to ride on him is also glorious, but he goes such a very little way, and then he goes back again, which is always dull. But this great hairy beast went on and on and on along the streets and through squares and gardens. It was a glorious city. Almost everything was built of marble, red or white or black. Every now and then the party crossed a bridge, and I think that's what we're seeing here. It was not till they had climbed to the hill, which is the centre of the town, that they saw that the whole city was divided into 20 circles, alternately land and water, and over each of the water circles were the bridges by which they had come. And now they were in a great square. A vast building filled up one side of it. It was overlaid with gold and had a dome of silver. The rest of the buildings round the square were of orichalcum, and it looked more splendid than you can possibly imagine, standing up bold and shining in the sunlight. Quite impressive. Just turn that one off for now and get ready for the next one, which is... So it's ready for when we read the next section. I think somebody's stacking up the firewood for our fireplace tonight. And it looked more splendid than you can possibly imagine, standing up bold and shining in the sunlight. You would like a bath, said the captain, as soon as the hairy elephant went clumsily down on his knees. It's customary, you know, before entering the presence. We have baths for men, women, horses, and cattle. The high-class baths are here. Our father Poseidon gave us a spring of hot water and one of cold. The children had never before bathed in baths of gold. It feels very splendid, said Cyril, splashing. At least, of course, it's not gold. It's... Or what's its name, said Robert. Hand over that towel. The bathing hall had several great pools sunk below the level of the floor. One went down to them by steps, one individually. If you wanted to go into this bath, this pool, you had to go down by steps. Jimmy, said Anthea timidly when they were very clean and boiled looking. They all met in the flowery courtyard of the public area of the bath. Don't you think all this seems much more like now than Babylon or Egypt? Oh, I forget. You've never been there. I know a little of those nations, however, said he, and I quite agree with you. A most discerning remark, my dear, he added awkwardly. This city certainly seems to indicate a far higher level of civilization than the Egyptian or Babylonish, and... Follow me, said the captain. Now, boys, get out of the way. He pushed through a little crowd of boys who were playing with dried chestnuts fastened to a string. Ginger, remarked Robert, they're playing conkers, just like the kids in Kentish Town Road. He's like saying, gee, golly, when he said ginger. They could now see that that 3 walls surrounded the island on which they were. The outermost wall was of brass. The captain told them, brass is what the captain told them. The next, which looked like silver, was covered with tin, because they both have a colourless shine. And the innermost one was of orichalcum, and right in the middle was a wall of gold with golden towers and gates. "Behold the temples of Poseidon," said the captain. There you go. "Behold the temple of Poseidon," said the captain. That's obviously him pointing. "It is not lawful for me to enter. I will await your return here." I'm just going to make it a bit bigger for you because these have actually been done with a lot of detail. See? And he's pointing up at these gates and the ornamentation and obviously the rest of the building that's at the centre of this city. Quite impressive. "I will await your return here." He told them that what they ought to say, and which is good. They've had that somewhere else before too, where someone has instructed them on how you converse or address the important people that you're about to meet. Sorry, my throat's getting a bit dry. It's probably the captain's voice. He told them what they ought to say, and the 5 people from Fitzroy Street took hands and went forward. The golden gates opened slowly. "We are the children of the sun," said Cyril, as he had been told, "and our high priest, at least that's what the captain calls him. We have a different name for him at home." "What is his name?" asked a white-robed man who stood in the doorway with his arms extended. Jimmy," replied Cyril, and he hesitated as Anthea had done. It really did seem to be taking a great liberty with so learned a gentleman, because to them Jimmy is a children's name, a friendly, like a pet name, like a nickname. Jimmy is short for James, usually. And as an adult, someone who's called James but people are using the nickname will usually be called Jim, not Jimmy. So the E on the end of it tends to make it sound like it's more for children. So these children growing up in a culture where that's the normal way of speaking are finding it a little bit odd calling him Jimmy, which is why they hesitate when they go to say his name and they say Jimmy. Just to make things a little bit different. Right. We'll carry on. I was just getting ready for the next picture. And I can move over again. Jimmy, replied Cyril, and he hesitated as Anthea had done. It really did seem to be taking a great liberty with so learned a gentleman. And we have come to speak with your kings in the temple of Poseidon. Does that word sound right? He whispered anxiously. Quite, said the learned gentleman. It's very odd. I can understand what you say to them, but not what they say to you. The Queen of Babylon found that too, said Cyril. It's part of the magic. Oh, what a dream, said the learned gentleman. Now the noise you can hear in the background is someone lighting the fire downstairs. I've got something for my throat now. Oh, what a dream, said the learned gentleman. The white-robed priest had been joined by others, and they were all bowing low. Enter, he said. Enter, children of the sun, with your high Jimmy. In the inner courtyard stood the temple, all of silver, with gold pinnacles and doors and 20 enormous statues with bright gold of men and women. Enormous statues in bright gold of men and women. She phrases some things back to front to how I'm used to. Also an immense pillar of the other precious yellow metal. They went through the doors, and the priest led them up a stair into a gallery from which they could look down onto the glorious place. The 10 kings are even now choosing the bull. "It is not lawful for me to behold," said the priest, and fell downward, face downward, on the floor outside the gallery. The children looked down. Just a moment. What was the name of that stuff? I need to write it down so we can look it up. We'll have to come back to it. The children looked down. The roof was of ivory adorned with the 3 precious metals, and the walls were lined with the favourite orichalcum. There it is. ORICALCHUM. And I shall see if I can find out if it's actually a real substance. It may be, and it may be one where we have a different name for it now, or one where it was historically known of, but never actually known in the modern day to be able to know what it actually would be called now. At the far end of the temple was a statue group, the like of which no one living has ever seen. It was of gold, and the head of the chief figure reached to the roof. That figure was Poseidon, the father of the city. He stood in a great chariot. Thank you for subscribing, Tina. That's wonderful. That's such a blessing. And I hope that you can continue to enjoy reading with us. The figure was of Poseidon, the father of the city. He stood in a great chariot drawn by 6 enormous horses, and round about it were 100 mermaids riding on dolphins. 10 men, splendidly dressed and armed only with sticks and ropes, were trying to capture one of some 15 bulls, who ran this way and that about the floor of the temple. The children held their breath, for the bulls looked dangerous, and the great horned heads were swinging more and more wildly. Anthea did not like looking at the bulls. She looked about the gallery and noticed that another staircase led up from it to a still higher story. Also, that a door led out into the open air where there seemed to be a balcony. So that when a shout went up and Robert whispered, "Got him," and she looked down and saw the herd of bulls being driven out of the temple by whips, and the 10 kings following, one of them spurring with his stick a black bull that writhed and fought in the grip of a lasso, she answered the boys' agitated, "Now we shan't see anything more," with, "Yes, we can. There's an outside balcony." So they crowded out, but very soon the girls crept back. "I don't like sacrifices," said Jane. So she and Anthea went and talked to the priest, who was no longer lying on his face, but sitting on the top step, mopping his forehead with his robe, for it was a hot day. "It's a special sacrifice," he said. "Usually it's only done on the justice days every 5 years and 6 years alternately, and then they drink the cup of wine with some of the bull's blood in it, and swear to judge truly, and they wear the sacred blue robe and put out all the temple's fires. But this today is because the city is so upset by the odd noises from the sea, and the god inside the big mountain speaking with his thunder voice. But all that's happened so often before. If anything could make me uneasy, it wouldn't be that." "What would it be?" said Jane kindly. "It would be the lemmings." "Who are they? Enemies?" "They're a sort of rat, and every year they come swimming over from the country that no man knows, and stay here a while, and then swim away. This year they haven't come. You know rats won't stay on a ship that's going to be wrecked. If anything horrible were going to happen to us, it's my belief those lemmings would know, and that may be why they've fought shy of us." "What do you call this country?" asked the Samiad, suddenly putting its head out of its bag. "Atlantis," said the priest. "Then I advise you to get on to the highest ground you can find. I remember hearing something about a flood here. Look here, you." It turned to Anthea. "Let's get home. The prospect's too wet for my whiskers." That's the Samiad is allergic to water. The girls obediently went to find their brothers, who were leaning on the balcony railings. "Where's the learned gentleman?" said Anthea. there he is, below, said the priest, who had come with them. Your high jevvv is with the kings. The 10 kings were no longer alone. The learned gentleman, no one had noticed how he got there, stood with them on the steps of an altar on which lay the dead body of the black bull. All the rest of the courtyard was thick with people, seemingly of all classes, and all were shouting, "The sea! The sea!" "Be calm," said the most kingly of the kings, he who had lassoed the bull. "Our town is strong against the thunders of the sea and of the sky." "I want to go home," whined the Samiad. "We can't go home without him," said Anthea firmly. "Jimmy!" she called. "Jimmy!" and waved to him. He heard her and began to come towards her through the crowd. They could see from the balcony the sea captain edging his way out from among the people, and his face was dead white, like paper. I would say that's something to pay attention to, because the sea captain would be very familiar with what the sea is like, what it normally does. If it's doing something different to normal, you need to pay attention to it. And his face was dead white, like paper. "To the hills!" he cried in a loud and terrible voice, and above his voice came another voice, louder, more terrible, the voice of the sea. The girls looked seaward. Across the smooth distance of the sea, something huge and black rolled towards the town. It was a wave, but a wave of 100 feet in height. A wave that looked like a mountain, a wave rising higher and higher till suddenly it seemed to break in two. One half of it rushed out to sea again, the other— "Oh," cried Anthea, "the town, the poor people." "It's all thousands of years ago, really," said Robert, but his voice trembled. They hid their eyes for a moment. Here they are. They're up the tower and they're looking, and there's part of the wave coming in, and they're hiding their eyes. See? They're all hiding their eyes because it's just too much for them. Oh my goodness. I'll just see if I can give you a little bit more picture. That wave is quite impressive. There's the wave towering over parts of the city. There's people on one of the bridges there. And then there's other people all falling down and running and all sorts of things. And the children are on the high tower up at the top of the temple on the hill in the centre of the city. That may be their only hope of survival, but not for long, because don't forget, Atlantis has disappeared. Oh my goodness. Yes, very. Not my idea of fun. And think of the poor Samiad, who actually, he gets very, very ill if he gets slightly wet. And has to recover for quite some time. If he gets too wet, he will actually die from it, because he is a sand creature. He's the sand fairy. And so, of course, he wants to get home too. It's like, so stressful. Anyway, so I'll turn off the picture and carry on reading once I've found what the next one is meant to be, just because I don't want you getting too stressed about it. There will be another picture. We haven't got to the end of the book yet. Find the right page number. Right. And then we shall carry on, because we've still got a few pages to go before the end of today's reading. It's all thousands of years ago, really, said Robert, but his voice trembled, because it's different when you're actually there seeing it happening to reading about it in a book or knowing it from having learned about history. They hid their eyes for a moment. They could not bear to look down, for the wave had broken on the face of the town, sweeping over the quays and docks, overwhelming the great storehouses and factories, tearing gigantic stones from forts and bridges, and using them as battering rams against the temples, because there were multiple temples in the city. Great ships were swept over the roofs of the houses and dashed down halfway up the hill among ruined gardens and broken buildings. Trying to make sense of the sentence before I read it. The water ground brown fishing boats to powder on the golden roof of the palace. roofs of the palaces. Then the wave swept back towards the sea. "I want to go home," cried the Samoyed fiercely. "Oh, yes, yes," said Jane, and the boys were ready, but the learned gentleman had not come. Then suddenly they heard him dash up to the inner gallery, crying, "I must see the end of the dream." He rushed up the higher flight, which is where the others had been hoping to go. The others followed him. They found themselves in a sort of turret, roofed, but open to the air at sides. The learned gentleman was leaning on the parapet, and as they rejoined him, the vast wave rushed back on the town. This time it rose higher, destroyed more. "Come home," cried the Samoyed. "That's the last. I know it is. That's the last. Over there." It pointed with a claw that trembled. "Oh, come," cried Jane, holding up the amulet. "I will see the end of the dream," cried the learned gentleman, probably with a lot more strength and emotion in his voice than he usually displays. "You'll never see anything else if you do," said Cyril. "Oh, Jimmy," appealed Anthea, "I'll never bring you out again." "You'll never have the chance if you don't go soon," said the Samoyed. "I will see the end of the dream," said the learned gentleman obstinately. It's probably what he was more like as a child. The hills around were black with people fleeing from the villages to the mountains, and even as they fled, thin smoke broke from the great white peak, and then a faint flash of flame. Then the volcano began to throw up its mysterious fiery inside parts. The earth trembled, ashes and sulphur showered down, a rain of fine pumice stone fell like snow on all the dry land. The elephants from the forest rushed up towards the peaks. Great lizards 30 yards long broke from the mountain pools and rushed down towards the sea. The snows melted and rushed down, first in avalanches and then in roaring torrents. Great rocks cast up by the volcano fell splashing into the sea miles away. "Oh, this is horrible," cried Anthea. "Come home, come home." "The end of the dream," gasped the learned gentleman. "Hold up the amulet," cried the Samoyed suddenly. The place where they stood was now crowded with men and women, and the children were strained tight against the parapet. The turret rocked and swayed. The wave had reached the golden wall. Jane held up the amulet. "Now," cried the Samoyed, "say the word." And as Jane said it, the Samoyed leapt from its bag and bit the hand of the learned gentleman. At the same moment, the boys pushed him through the arch, and all followed him. He turned to look back, and through the arch he saw nothing but a waste of waters, with above it the peak of the terrible mountain with fire raging from it. He staggered back to his chair. "What a ghastly dream," he gasped. "Oh, you're here, my dears. Can I do anything for you?" "You've hurt your hand," said Anthea gently. "Let me bind it up." The hand was indeed bleeding rather badly. The Samoyed had crept back to its bag. All the children were very white. "Never again," said the Samoyed later on, "will I go into the past with a grown-up person. I will say for you four, you do as you're told," though it's taken a while. "We didn't even find the amulet," said Anthea later still. "Of course you didn't. It wasn't there. Only the stone it was made of was there. It fell onto a ship miles away that managed to escape and got to Egypt. I could have told you that." "I wish you had," said Anthea, and her voice was still rather shaky. "Why didn't you?" "You never asked me," said the Samoyed very sulkily. "I'm not the sort of chap to go shoving my oar in when it's not wanted." "Mr. Jimmy's friends will have something worth having to put in his article." "Friend will have something worth having to put in his article now," said Cyril, very much later indeed. "Not he," said Robert sleepily. "The learned Jimmy will think it's a dream, and it's 10 to 1 he never tells the other chap a word about it at all." Robert was quite right on both points. The learned gentleman did, and he never did. The learned gentleman did, think it was a dream, and never did tell his friend about it or anyone else. And that's the end of that chapter. And it's also the end of today's reading, because the next chapter is quite a long one. So I'm sorry about that, but you'll have to come back next time to find out what happens next. But I will give you a little hint by giving you the chapter title. The next chapter, chapter 10, is called The Little Black Girl and Julius Caesar. Wonder if that means that she was a slave, or if that means that she was just someone who had come from Africa. We'll find out, won't we? Next time in the story. Now, I have told you before, I didn't today, that often we come across attitudes that we don't consider acceptable in our day and age, but they were passably acceptable or even fully embraced in the era that the books were written. And rather than being upset by that and refusing to read the books and never learning anything about how other people used to think because we won't engage with them, we actually do read the books and we think about the attitudes that they portray, and we learn from them so that we don't continue with attitudes that may be inappropriate in our day and age that we hadn't actually thought about that we were holding. So we can learn from anything, and why not? It's a good idea. So thank you for being here. I hope you had lovely snacks and lovely drinking things that you were able to enjoy while I was reading. And I'm looking forward to reading the next part of the book with you. If you are wanting to find out, wanting to hear more stories that I have read before, go to my YouTube channel. I'll give you the link for that. Go to my YouTube channel, go to the playlists page, and every book that I have read so far is there. I take all the videos from when I have actually read them live on Twitch, and I put them into playlists over on YouTube so that you can listen to a whole book. There are a couple of playlists where it's all of the stories that one lady wrote, because they were spread across a number of stories, a number of books, and each of the stories is very, very short. And then the other one is both Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, or whatever the original titles were, is actually one playlist, not two, just because I went straight from one book into the next. But that doesn't matter. So if you want more stories, that's where you go, is YouTube. If you're watching this over on YouTube and you actually like the idea of being part of the conversation when I'm reading a book, so I can say hello to you when you follow me while I'm live, or so you can look things up and share them with me so that I can tell the others in chat and also on YouTube who are watching the thing that you found out about for me while I'm reading. Then what you do is you go to my About page on YouTube and you look for my Twitch link. I'm not going to give it to you here because I'm actually on Twitch at the moment, but you look for my Twitch link and then you follow me on Twitch, and Twitch will tell you when I go live, just like YouTube will tell you when I've put a new video up. So those are the two places. On YouTube, I will trim the videos so it's just the video window rather than all the extra bits that are around the edge and the opportunity to chat. The videos over on YouTube are not designated for kids. That's a particular classification, because the ones that are designated for kids means that you can't actually leave comments about them. And it's quite nice to hear from people when they've actually enjoyed finding the stories, listening to them, remembering them from when they were kids, things like that. That happens on YouTube. Now, if you leave a comment for me and I'm not live on Twitch, then I won't get to see that. So what we have instead is what's called a Discord server. And I'm going to give you that link, and you're most welcome to join the Discord server. There's a set of rules that it will tell you about, and you have to agree to those rules, and then you can join. You can see illustrations from some of the books we've read in the past, but you can also get into conversation about the stories we're reading. If you want to have a conversation specifically about one of the books we've read, then put it in the channel for that book. And if I haven't yet got a channel for that book, make a comment about it in the general chat area and I will start one. And also you can make suggestions for other books that I can read. I read public domain books. I don't read copyright books that are still in copyright. Well, not these days, I don't. Just because I think that authors ought to be paid for their work and not have somebody else profiting for them. And because at this stage I don't actually have any way of paying somebody for the use of their book, I'm not prepared to steal it from them. But you can borrow books from the library if you want to read books from the library. If you want to read any of the books that I do read, the public domain ones, then you can go to Gutenberg, Project Gutenberg. See if that link worked. Yes, it did. Project Gutenberg is where they have public domain books. Not every book that is in the public domain is there. There are a lot of non-fiction ones. There are a lot of fiction ones. There are also children's fiction books, which is where most of my ones are from if I'm not reading from a physical book. But also, if you like the idea of someone reading you stories as just a normal person, not a properly engineered and produced audio book, which are great. I listen to those when I'm cooking. But if you actually want to listen to stories that are read by real people rather than by somebody who's absolutely marvelous at it, but you don't feel like you can relate to them quite the same way, then join Codex. Codex, there's the image for it's down in the bottom corner on my Twitch overlay there. Codex, I shall give you a link for as well. So the link that I'm giving you now is for Codex's Discord. Codex is a group of people who read public domain books. Most of them read books that are written for adults. Some of them will also read books that are written for children. I'm the only one, as far as I know, who specialises in just reading books that are written for children. On Codex's Discord server, you can get into conversation about the books that we're reading. You can make suggestions, see if anyone else has read any of those before. And also, if you're interested in listening online to people who read these books, we've got together links for all the different members of Codex who are readers, and I've got them down below on my Twitch About page in a section there that has the Codex logo on it, and it's got a list with their name and their link for their Twitch channel. So if you're on YouTube and that really appeals to you, then once again go across to my Twitch channel, which you will find the link for on my About page on YouTube, and look for the section that says Codex, and then you'll find this list of links for all the different people who read there. Great bunch of people. Some people actually do voice acting and audiobook reading as their day jobs, and then in their spare time they read in this relaxed manner where they don't have to worry so much about having to get it perfect every time and that sort of stuff. But also a lot of them play games and things like that as well on Twitch, not just read. I just read. Sometimes I chat like this. Well, actually, every time I chat, but that sort of stuff. So anyway, all of that sort of stuff, all this wonderful stuff, and both my Twitch page and my YouTube page will have other ways of getting hold of me on social media like Twitter, Instagram, stuff like that. So find me somewhere and say hi. Let me know what your favorite book is that you remember. It may not be all-time favorite, but the one that you currently remember is your favorite book from when you were growing up. If you have one, it may be one I've never heard of before, so it would be great if you can share that with me. I look forward to hearing from you and seeing you around the place, seeing you here again next time. I will be back in 2 days' time reading the next chapter, which is chapter 10. The Little Black Girl and Julius Caesar, and I'm really intrigued to find out what's going on with that, because Julius Caesar is a very famous man. So far the others haven't been. So have a great time between now and then. I hope you stay well, hope you look after yourselves, and see you next time. In the meantime, happy reading. Bye.